Good evening. I'm Frank Congelos. I'm the managing partner here at CNA Financial Group. It's my pleasure to be with you this evening. We're going to be discussing a topic we refer to them as retirement matters. This subject, is pretty much what all of CNA is really based upon. A few years back, I wrote a book that was referred to as Last Check, and the whole point of the book when I wrote it back then was really to deal with the point in time of when we're about to retire, when we retire, and how to retire very comfortably. So, we've got a nice topic for you tonight. I'm looking forward to the time that we're going to spend together. So, I'll kind of jump right into it. So, like anything else, I always have to, deal with what I call the compliance side of, what we do. And you're going to see that coming up on the next slide. But the way I'd like you to kind of think of our conversation tonight before I even, get into that or, bring that up is, I always say is, what if your next check was your last check? And so when we think in terms of that, if you're over 50 or 50 or 55 or getting closer to retirement, we start to think in terms of, what could occur or what does our life look like with regard to our finances. And so with that being said, let me jump into it a little bit. As I jump into it, and again, here's those disclosures that I always say that we got to make sure that you see. And basically what this is going to tell you is any areas of taxation or law, check with a qualified professional. Anytime I show you interest rates or any things like that, I always tell you on investments, they go up and down. You go make or lose money. And so, just wanted to make sure you saw the appropriate disclosures for that. And anything that we talk about is really for concept tonight, not really getting into anything in a deep dive detail or recommendation for you specifically. So when we think about retirement, the whole thing is how do we really determine whether you're ready or not? And I always say is as you're accumulating money over your lifetime, there's a few things that go into money. And I always call them the 3 R's. There's a rate of accumulation, there's a rate of return, and then there's a rate of distribution. While we're saving, okay, and while we're working, it really becomes more about rate of accumulation. When we're retired, it becomes more about the rate of distribution. And we talk about that, as far as how does that impact your life? And at the end of the day, we look at things a little different than many other financial firms. Oftentimes, people determine their wealth based upon net worth, but net worth doesn't always equate to cash flow. It's interesting. We're here in the Northeast in New Jersey. And real estate, as an example, is very expensive here in the Northeast. Not uncommon for someone to have a $500,000 home, $1 million home, $800,000 home. And all that looks great for, say, net worth, perhaps of retirement. It doesn't translate into cash flow or quality of life. So when we think in terms of, retirement ready and retirement matters and things of that nature, what we really look at is cash flow. Because at the end of the day, cash flow is really what matters the most. Net worth over time, you'll see increases, and this is showing an example of average net worth and medium net worth. But what you're going to see is over time, net worth will continue to increase as your debt is going down, your assets are growing until you hit retirement, and then it might level off a little bit because we went from accumulating to distributing and enjoying assets. But at the end of the day, net worth is ultimately, I say, the scorecard that we hand to somebody else. Is like playing a round of golf. You hand the card in at the end, and you go, how did I do? And the net worth is ultimately with my kids and my grandkids and everybody's going to get. It's what I didn't necessarily convert to cash flow. So it's just a perspective. Cash flow is really the key to quality of life when I say financial quality of life. And when we talk about cash flow, if you think about it, two aspects of life, and you'll see it again in a few minutes, but you're going to see, it's kind of like that chart. We're going up in cash flow. And what that's actually representative of is for most people, the cash flow I made when I was 20 years old versus the cash flow what I had when I was 40 versus the cash flow I had at 55, I noticed that it's increased over time. And then something interesting happens is when people retire, that earned cash flow stops. And now what we're doing is we're living on whatever assets we have, and how does that carry forth for the rest of the ride? And so It's also one of the biggest fears for people because, we kid and I say, hey, when you get to retirement, can you tell me how long you're going to live? And people look at me and they go, I don't know. And then I'll say to them something simple like, well, if you worked for the last, say, 30, 35, or even 40 years, it's conceivable nowadays that we're seeing people that retire at 65 that are here at 85, 20 years later, 95, 30 years later. And then we're also seeing, people that hit 100, 103. I think I was looking on Facebook and one of the chefs or one of the cooks that are out, I think he was celebrating, I think he said his mom hit 106. And I was like, wow, there's some longevity in that family. So we don't know how long we're going to be here. And so the greatest fear for people when they get to retirement is, will they have enough money for the rest of the ride? And it becomes a big concern. So we're going to be talking about this retirement readiness, retirement matters all through this conversation. But, I always say is the way you've got to look at it is, some of us, and I'm one of those, I'm guilty of this, which is, people go, Frank, when are you going to retire? I said, why would I ever retire? I love what I do. It's like if you love what you do, you get quality of life, you get paid, and you find purpose in what you do. Most people that are doing that, they might not think about retirement. However, there are a lot of people that want to retire. And there will also come a point for all of us, including myself, where even I have to stop working. Okay. And when that occurs, it's going to happen. And if we choose it to happen, I call that retirement. When we don't choose it to happen and I stop working sooner, we call that a life event. So when we think about that, we've got to look in retirement and we say, if we were to stop working today, okay, and we were retired, where does our money come from? Where does that cash flow come from? And so cash flow in retirement starts with one of the most simple things that people recognize. They think about it, they wonder about it. We do seminars about it. And it starts with what I call government programs, which are Social Security. And so once we go from Social Security, which is a government program that most people pay into, then we go to public or private programs that we might have with our employer. And some people will also have, pensions. As an example, state employees, township employees, people that work for large companies, some of them still get pensions, which is they stop working and then they get income for life. And so it's very nice. Beyond that, we have what we call accumulated savings, which is AKA, we call it qualified, but it's more commonly heard of as 401k plans, IRAs, profit sharing plans, and retirement plans from work. And what occurs is that when we leave the public sector or private sector and we end up with capital, that capital, if it was put away for retirement, we call that qualified money. It gets set aside. And then what we do is we look to take distributions off of that for the rest of our life, okay, or for some period of time. And those are retirement accounts. In addition to retirement accounts, we have what we call the non-qualified accounts. And for those of you who saw that bright light, sometimes I get a great idea. I just light up the room. And by the way, I kid a lot, so I hope that you enjoy this as I say that to you. But so what occurs is we also have non-retirement accounts, which these are the funds we have in the bank. These are annuities we have and all the other different things. It's non-qualified just means we didn't receive necessarily certain tax preferences, but all of this matters. Now, on the other side of that, this is what I call the voluntary side of retirement. But what about what we call non-voluntary? So non-voluntary could be one of a few things. It could be loss of a job. And we say in the event of a loss of a job, we want to make sure people have adequate reserves. But what happens when somebody gets sick or hurt? In the event of sick or hurt, then we've got to look at what do we have available. And then we go to those social benefits. We look at, Social Security. We'll look at, state disability. We'll look at different things that we have. And we also go to private benefits with regard to like deferred compensation, insurances, and things of that nature. And then the last thing that I always point out also is we look at our personal assets. What do we have in savings? What do we have in investments? So when we think about it, in the event that we stop involuntary, job loss, sick or disabled, or if we're not here, it's all of those things that are coming into play, whether it be government benefits, company benefits, or personal assets, which has to carry us for whatever that ride is. either providing cash flow to ourselves so that we can maintain a quality of life, or going to our family to maintain their quality of life. So just a little insight for you. So here at CNA Financial Group, for years, people say, you're different. How come you're different? How come I haven't heard of this before? And I would oftentimes say to people, we're solving for a different equation. The equation we solve for is cash flow, because we believe that financial success is cash flow under any and every circumstance. If I were just trying to, plan for highest net worth, okay, it's not necessarily representative of true quality of life. As I mentioned before, my residence, although may be very expensive, makes me feel good. It's very comfortable, but it doesn't give me cash flow. I actually kid with people and I say, your house is actually a liability from a cash flow standpoint. It takes money from us, not gives money to us. It's actually a deferred asset for our beneficiaries when they go and they liquidate it and they convert it to cash flow. But the reality is a house takes cash flow from you. When we think of cash flow, we're thinking of what brings cash flow to you. And the more cash flow you have, the more you get to enjoy. And that, goes to your quality of life. And then I also explain to people and they go, well, Frank, what if I don't use all that cash flow? I say, well, any unused cash flow then gets accumulated. As it gets accumulated, it just grows your net worth. And then it ultimately gets left to somebody else, if you think about it. So cash flow is what you enjoy. Plus, the homes and so forth, you get enjoyment out of that. But your net worth is ultimately what we leave to somebody else. So important for you to keep that in mind. So it's interesting is there's a lot of financial professionals out. And, people always, I'll say, hey, what do you think of your advisor? And they, oh, my advisor's great. But when I'm meeting them, they're typically in the accumulation side of life. And so oftentimes they don't know if their planning is good or bad. And the reason being is when you're going up the mountain and I'm not taking money from the portfolio, okay, or and so forth to live on, whether it goes up or down, it doesn't really matter. I'm not taking it out. So it's okay. However, when I'm going down the mountain, which is I'm now retired and I'm taking money out of the portfolio, there's a lot of things that could put you at risk. They have a saying, over the years, and it's a fact that, if this was Mount Everest and, there's people that climb it every year, but they'll tell you that there's more people that die on the descent, not the ascent. Getting up the mountain is one thing, but there's more risk in coming down the mountain. And it's the same thing with money and retirement. There's more risk coming down the mountain. So here's some of the things that we look at. If I'm going up and accumulating, it's about rate of return and it's about rate of accumulation. And by the way, out of the two things that are, you can deal with, there's only one that you can actually control, which is rate of accumulation, which is a topic for another day. Rate of return comes from the markets, very hard for you to influence. It's really whatever the market pays. As an example, if I was sitting here 5 years ago, interest rates were inherently low. What occurred over the last few years or back in 2022, interest rates went higher, okay? We can't control that. Likewise, I can't control if the stock market is going to go up or if the stock market is going to go down. But I can control the rate of accumulation of how I save. So it's a topic for a different day. We have a whole program on it, but going up the mountain is one thing. Coming down the mountain, a little different. Coming down the mountain, okay, not only does it get into what I call rate of return, but it's rate of distribution. And depending upon how we distribute will determine how successful we are. So before I get into that, one of the things I always tell people to think about is if you were to retire today, what does it cost you to live? What's your burn rate, as I would say? What does it cost? Because many people, don't often do a budget. They don't look at where they're at. I don't even like the word budget. It always feels like I'm, someone's telling me what I can and can't spend, and I'm not into that. I, kind of like a little bit more freedom in my life. But the reality is what I've got to look at is if I'm thinking about retiring, I really have to get a handle on two things, which is number one, what sources of income might I have available to me? And number two, what are my expenses? And then the question is do I have surplus? I call it more money left at the end of the month, or do I have a shortfall, which is more month left at the end of the money? So having said that is you really need to start thinking about that in order to be retirement ready, which is what does it cost you to live? What will it cost you to live? We have a statement that we make around here, and we kid about it, which is we say, do I spend more money Monday to Friday while I'm working, or more money on the weekends? And everybody goes, I spend more on the weekends. And when you retire, every day is Saturday, every day is Sunday. And what we're doing is we're looking for different things to fill time with. We're looking for different events to do. We're looking for different projects. So, where we think in retirement, oh, I'm not going to need anywhere near as much money to live. It's like, wait a minute, every day is Saturday, every day is the weekend. So it may not be as much of a pay cut as you think, or where your expenses really go down. They may stay the same. They could even go a little higher. So keep that in mind. So when you're thinking about those expenses, very simply stated, there's certain expenses that you have that are fixed, the fixed expenses, and you should, kind of break them down this way. Fixed expenses are going to be, if you still have a mortgage in retirement, and I'm not a big advocate of that in retirement, that's a personal preference. We work with our clients to figure out, does it make sense? Does it not make sense? But you still got real estate taxes. You still have utilities. You still have insurances. Cars don't last forever. You still might have a car lease. You might have a car payment. You're still going to have car insurance. You're going to have health insurance. All of these are fixed. They're going to be something that you're paying month in and month out, quarter in, quarter out. And oftentimes there is inflation on all of those, which need to be accounted for. The variable expenses are all of the other things, such as going out to dinner. Food costs can vary. Haircuts, not that I can relate to that, as you can see, but that's going to vary over time. There's lots of variable expenses, traveling and everything else, but the fixed expenses and variable expenses, you just have to start to identify earlier on. It's important to get a handle on that. After that, now we've got to talk about when someone is getting ready to retire or in retirement, where does cash flow come from? And so the most common that everybody thinks about is they think about Social Security. We have different processes and technology to help determine, should you take it at 62, 65, 67, 70, when should you take it? Okay. There's a lot of factors that come in, and we can provide all the different analysis for you based upon your health, based upon your overall financial picture. But how does Social Security work? What about pensions? And when we talk about pensions, again, if you've worked for large companies or you work for companies that provide pensions and so forth, all that comes in. Some people even get deferred compensation. Deferred compensation may be where you have an agreement where you work, where the day you stop working, they're going to do something for you for some extended period of time, providing some income. Common nowadays, many people have also put annuities in place over the years. They became more and more popular in a very low interest rate environment when people were looking for forms of guaranteed income. So do you have annuities, and how will that work? For business owners, not uncommon that there are business buyouts, and there are agreements that are in place on how a business is structured. We have a couple of our advisors that are certified exit planners, and we've been assisting business owners with figuring out what's the best way to sell your business. And then also in today's day and age, it's not uncommon that we run across people that have some rental income. They own a house somewhere. Maybe they have a vacation rental, or they're doing VRBO on something that they purchased over the years, or some of them that'll have, commercial real estate, residential, and so forth. But all of these are different forms of cash flows. Okay, so we look and we say, well, what provides cash flow? Once we go from what provides cash flow, then we go to the next thing, which is, what do we have with regard to accumulated assets to be converted to cash flow? And when we look at that, we're then looking at savings, bank accounts, CDs, things of that nature, investments, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, all of the different things, managed fiduciary accounts, the retirement accounts, such as the 401ks, which ultimately become IRAs oftentimes. What happens with those? Because those are accumulated assets. And then there may be, something else that you have in place that you've accumulated over the years. So we look at all the income producing assets, and then we look at accumulated assets. And in the accumulated assets, it's interesting to note, how do they distribute cash flow? Because remember, I've been saying quite a bit in this conversation today, is cash flow is really the key in retirement. So when we think about it, you've got guaranteed income sources, you've got asset distribution, and we also want to have what I refer to as some free capital. So free capital means this. I was at a seminar once, and there was a speaker up, and he said, it's interesting, but retirement looks like this. First, when you retire, you're in what we call the go-go years. So the whole idea of the go-go years is that you're healthy, you're going, you're vibrant, and you've got time and money, and you're doing the things that you've wanted to do for years, such as travel, rent a boat, rent a mobile home, drive around the country, go to Italy, go all the things while you're healthy and you could do, you do. But what happens, there comes a point in time where travel becomes cumbersome. Doing things start to feel like a lot of work, and we call that the slow go years. So we tend to spend more in the earlier stage of retirement, then we get the slow go years, and then there comes a point in time where we just can't travel anymore. We don't want to do certain things anymore. And that's what I call the no-go years that we heard. So it's the go-go, slow-go, no-go. And so we've got to make sure that we have to have some free capital so that we can enjoy it. So we're not spending what I call important money, critical money, that we're going to pay for it later because we're not going to have it in case we live a long time. So we got to make sure there's some free capital. So here's how assets provide income. First part of assets providing income is we have interest income. So interesting, and again, today versus 3, 4, 5 years ago, interest income 3, 4, 5 years ago, people go, Frank, I'm getting 10 basis points or 0.5% or 1% on a bank account that I have, or the bond interest rates were 2 and 3%. Actually, interest nowadays, because interest rates in 2022 came up and they're still at fairly good rates, but interest rates today are typically hovering somewhere around 4% or 5%. Could be a little higher, could be a little lower. It's going to fluctuate. But interest is one form of income that you get. Dividends are like interest payments on stocks and different things of that nature. And then you have what are called bonds that are paying interest payments. They refer to that as the yield on the bond, which is how much is the bond actually paying. And then there's a thing that's called total return. So the idea of total return is, if I were to look at, say, the S&P 500, which is what everybody hears about all day, or they hear about the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and it's had some phenomenal returns over the years. Some of them have averaged 8s and 10s or whatever. And again, they go up and down, but you get this average. But it wasn't 8 to 10% in cash flow. The dividend is the cash flow. The yield, that came off of that, again, is the cash flow. But the balance of the return came from the appreciation of the asset. So when we're in accumulation phase of life, that all works perfectly. But when I'm in retirement, the catch with that is that in a rising market, total return investing works fine. But when the market is flat or even down, it's not so fine, because I may be liquidating, and I will be liquidating shares to meet my cash flow requirements. So it's important that we keep that in mind. I'm going to show some examples of that. The last thing I'm going to point out is that over the years, annuities have become very popular. The reason why they've become popular is they're one of the types of investments where people can accumulate money on a tax-favored basis. They can structure certain types of annuities where they can get income for periods of time or for life. But there are different strategies through annuitization and payments and withdrawal that provide cash flow during retirement. So in the big picture, those are the general forms. Now, having said that, I always tell people there's the 4% rule that's out there. And, if I went back, say 3 or 4 years ago, that 4% rule all of a sudden was becoming more like a 3% or maybe not even 3% rule. And the reason being because interest rates were so low, they were becoming concerned about, can you take out a certain amount of money each year without running out of money? So you can Google it. I Googled it for you. And it says, what's a safe withdrawal rate in retirement? It tells you 4%. And then what that's pointing out to you, so I show you this, and this was put out by BlackRock. It's an example. It's not a guarantee of things. But what it's saying to someone is if they were taking out money at different periods of time, and it's showing an example of, say, starting in 1999 or from the year 2000, what occurs. And so when you look at, say, the orange line across the top, it's basically showing that people still have their capital for the most part, although it fluctuates, and they were distributing 4%. Then if I go to 5%, which is the yellow line, it's actually showing that people were taking that out, but that was starting to trail down and their capital was going down. You look at the green line, and what you're going to see is at 6%, they ran out of money. You look at 7%, the pink line, they ran out of money sooner. And then you look at somebody taking money out at 8%, they ran out of money pretty quickly. So because of that, that's where that safe withdrawal rate comes from that people talk about 4%. So here's the next thing that we talk about, which are, what about rates of return? And so I just mentioned to you about a 4% return and a 5% return. So here's the other side of that, is in order for me to get a 4% return, you've got to look at historically, where do you put money? And so what you're going to notice is from the bottom up, you're going to notice, over the course of, the last, say, 20, 25 years, it'll tell you what cash is paid, average returns. It'll tell you what fixed income is paid, which are, bonds and so forth. And it'll tell you on large company value stocks, diversified portfolios, large cap core, and small cap. But then if you look to the far right on there, there's something that's called standard deviation. And so standard deviation is almost like someone saying to you, so what's the G-force on the roller coaster? At what point do you lose your stomach? And so what that means is how much volatility is associated with each of those investments. So what happens is that level of volatility, the higher up I go, means that I may have more of that whipsaw effect going on. So although I may get a high return, I may get a lot of volatility. So when we're in retirement and we're distributing, most people are not comfortable with a lot of volatility. So it's important that you work with a financial professional to determine what level of risk, what level of volatility are you comfortable and is right for you, so that you're not buying and selling at the wrong times. And what I mean by buying and selling at the wrong times is this. If you think about it, when stocks inherently are going up, everybody loves them. It's like going up on the roller coaster. This is fun. It's wonderful. And then all of a sudden, when stocks are going down, everybody's losing their stomach. And so if you think about it, we all want to be in stocks when they're going up. So that means we're buying high. And then when all of a sudden they're going down, we're going to get us out, and we're selling as they're going down. Where we should be buying stocks when they're down and selling when they're high, we're doing the opposite. And so we're not necessarily wired for what's occurring. And so working with a professional, it's almost like having a dietitian. They're going to help you to determine what's the right diet for you, what's the right level of volatility, what's the right mix of asset classes to put in a portfolio so that you'll stay in for the ride to get the full return. Because it's not all one way. It's not a linear rate of return that we're getting. It's relevant. So when I talk about relevant, here's an example. And by the way, again, this is an example. This is not your actual portfolio. And, we mentioned before, but it's shown an example of what occurred in different periods of time with the S&P 500. And then what would a diversified portfolio have done? And so you'll notice in down markets, it looks like, and you'll see, the emotions that we go through. I lost money, or I didn't make as much money, things of that nature. But at the end of the day, it's conceivable that by having a balanced portfolio, that you may have gotten a comparable return without the whipsaw and the volatility of the ride. Okay. And so it's a little bit smoother of a return sometimes. That's why I say it's important to have somebody give you good advice to get you in the right portfolio for your risk tolerance. Here's another example, and this one is just showing, if we looked at the S&P 500 and we were saying, what if, you had the full up and the full down of it? And then on the other side, we're saying, what if you only had half the up and half the down? What would have occurred if that happened? And it's shown in this example that, over that period of time, and we're looking at, this is from Morningstar from 12/31/20, and it's just shown over a period of time what occurred. And what it effectively says is even with half the ups and half the downs, the end result was pretty close to the same thing. So when you look at that, and again, in accumulation, it all works fine. But when we're retired, okay, it's not as comfortable and it becomes relevant. So then we get into a thing we call a sequence of return risk. And so when we talk about sequence of return risk, you can get an average rate of return. And when I say an average rate of return, this is an example of, let's call it, it's shown markets going up and down and so forth. And it's showing that based upon the sequence in which the returns came in, how you have a dramatically different outcome. My favorite slide is this one. Oops, I went too far. Got to go back. Oops. Previous. Hold on one second. I'm technologically challenged sometimes, not all the time. So this is one of my favorite slides. And what this slide shows you is the following. It shows you on the left side of this, it shows, let's say, $1 million portfolio. We're taking out 4%. I really call it 5% per year because most portfolios have a management fee. So you got to kind of figure that in. So we're saying, hey, on $1 million, what if I was taking out 50,000 per year? Show me an example of what that looks like. And what this shows is back in 2000, we had an off year in the markets. So what we're showing here is that we had an off year that the market was off 9.1%. So when the market was off 9.1% and I took out $50,000, after all was said and done, I was at 863. And then I had a couple of other down years in the market and continue to take out my 50,000. So when I look and I go, so what did this look like over the course of the next 14 years? It shows that the portfolio would have been at $368,000. What if the returns were reversed? So instead of having a -9 in the first year, what if I had a -9 in the last year? Instead of having 13.6% in the last year, what if I had that in the first year? If I just reversed the returns, I go from, at the end of 14 years, say, of having 368,000, I've got $1,077,000. So the rate of return average is exactly the same, but the sequence of returns dramatically impacts in retirement how much I actually end up with. And by the way, you don't know what that's going to be. I don't know. Nobody knows what the sequence is. So when building out your retirement, this becomes relevant. That's why all of those other factors come in. And when I showed you that, the mountain, and I said, people die on the descent, not the ascent. And it's because of things of this nature that put people at risk. And it takes special planning to make sure it happens the way that we want it to happen. So having said that, now, how do we take the last few risks off the table? So we talked about market risk. We talked about sequence of returns. We talked about, deciding, what's fixed income, where's variable income. So here's how we take some of the risk off the table. Number one is we always want to make sure that you've got emergency funds and you have ample liquidity. And the reason being is if I've got, liquidity, we call it true liquidity. Perhaps when you saw that other slide, if I started out with a bad year in the market the first year in retirement, if I had liquidity elsewhere, maybe I don't have to sell something I have. I can get cash flow elsewhere and allow the portfolio to recover. Next thing, one of the biggest costs that people will see in retirement is going to be healthcare. So we're going to show you examples of that a little bit. What about when a spouse passes? And when I say a spouse passes, it's common today that Social Security for many people in retirement are real numbers. I mean, they're real dollars. And when I say that is, I see people nowadays where Social Security is $3,000 a month, $3,500 a month. If I have a working couple and I've had two of them, 3,000, 3,500 a month, I can easily have, somebody getting 40,000 a year from Social Security. And if I had a working spouse, there also could be getting 20, 30, $40,000 a year. And here's what happens, by the way. And if there was a non-working spouse, they get half of their spouse's benefits. So if one was at 40, the other one would have gotten 20. So the way it works in a couple is when they're both of normal retirement age, a spouse will get the greater of their benefit. The lower income spouse gets the greater of their own benefit or half of their spouse's benefit. However, when one of them passes, they lose the lower of the benefit. So think of the world this way. I showed you a thing that was called the 4% rule. So if somebody was getting $40,000 a year from Social Security, I'd probably need $1 million of assets to replace that, as a very simple example, if you thought about it. So I'm not telling you, hey, you got to run out and have an extra million. I'm just saying that it's not small change, it's real money. So making sure that protecting for a spouse, to make sure if we got two incomes is taken care of. And then the last thing I always say is, it's the desire of most people that the day that we're not here, the last thing that we would want is our family, our children, our grandchildren fighting over money or having any type of tension. So I always say is good estate planning documents are critical to having, really a secure retirement and to really, be what I call retirement ready. So let's do a little deeper dive on a couple of topics. And when I say that is, we're going to talk about longevity risk. And when I talk about longevity risk, what we're just showing you here is, I get clients that'll say from time to time, they'll go, Frank, I'm 65. Nobody's made it in my family, much more than 10 years. I'm not that concerned because I'll be showing things out 20, 30 years. And they go, I'm never going to make that. Here's the reality. Here's what, life expectancy looks like. When I start looking, I go, so, if I've got an individual, what you're seeing here is that, at age 92, so for a male, there's a 25% chance that somebody's going to be here. That's a high probability. I can't tell you which one. I always kid and I say the difference between an actuary and an Italian actuary. I am Italian. Is the actuaries tell you how many people per year pass away, and then the Italian actuary will tell you which ones. So those of you listening get a little chuckle out of that. I tell that to clients. I'm Italian. I can say it. So all kidding aside, here's the other one that's kind of interesting is when you look even female rates, and when I say rates is longevity, what's the probability of being here? It's like 25% chance at age 94, 50-50 shot of making it till 88. So as I mentioned before, you could be a long time in retirement. You go out at 60, 65, we're talking about, 20, 25, 30 years or more. So important to plan accordingly. Let's go a little bit further. This here, we're talking about inflation. We have an election coming up next week. You're hearing a lot about inflation. You've been hearing about, some people having a hard time making ends meet. Inflation's real. And, what this is telling us is, if I looked over, say, 20 years, and if, let's say, inflation was, as the Fed would like to be, say, 2%, which it's not, by the way, at the moment, it means that I would need 33% more income 20 years from today. If inflation is, say, 2.5%, I need 40% more income. At 3.5%, I need 50% more income. So what we're really saying is inflation, okay, is actually our purchasing power that I've got my dollars, they just don't buy as much anymore. It's like, I bought gas and it wasn't, $3 a gallon, it was $4 a gallon. And that puts tremendous pressure on retired people because they're not earning more and their income is not increasing necessarily with inflation. So it's important to keep inflation in mind, when you're planning for retirement. Loss of spouse, I just spoke a little bit about that. The other side of loss of spouse is long-term care, which, we always point out is I always say is, hey, if somebody, lives a really long life. They're 100 and something years old. They just don't wake up one morning. Boy, that was great, because it's like simple. But what happens if somebody has lingering illness over a period of time and things of that nature? It all puts additional pressure on everything, finances, emotions, and everything. So loss of spouse is a big deal. And it also, with regard to Social Security and other income options, it's impactful. This year is just rising healthcare costs. And when I talk about that, this does not include long-term care. So this is cost of insurance. When we're in retirement, there's a thing called IRMA. The more you make, the more it costs. There's your Medicare supplements. There's things that are not covered. There's the dental. And what this is showing is that inflation for medical over the last 20 years, 97%, not that 2 or 3% that we were just talking about. So when we look, they're showing an example, or they're showing that, hey, projected costs for healthcare in retirement in 2003, 160,000. 2023, 315,000, a 97% difference in costs. Big difference. So got to keep that in mind. And then the last thing I'm going to just touch on tonight is, it's not all based on finances. In order to be happy in retirement, money's a part of it, and I always give cheap plugs, which is, first book I ever wrote, it's almost 20 years ago, I think. I wrote a book that was called Discovering Responsible Wealth. And I talk about, I call them wealth building blocks, which is, family, health, faith, and everything else, all the different aspects of your life that are what it takes for you to be happy. So the reality is, when you go to retire, in order for you to have a happy and a fulfilling retirement, relationships matter. And when we talk about relationships matter, it's the time that, you get to spend with the people that you love and you care about, whether it be spouses, your kids, your grandkids, your friends. So it's a big deal. There's a few things here, and if you let us know, you can shoot us an email. I'll hit on just a few of these topics, but it'll talk about, where do you want to spend time? Who do you want to spend time with? But the next thing is where do you want to live? And when we talk about where you want to live, and I hear this a lot, from people, and they go, well, Frank, what about 2 houses? And I say, well, you remember, the idea starts out great, but then it turns into work, perhaps. And so you've got to kind of work all of that out. Or what about, you've been living in, the same house for the last 30 years, is that 4 or 5 bedroom colonial, and now there's 2 of you, or there's 1 of you. Are you staying there? You're going to downsize. And if you're going to downsize, what type of community? What are you going to be happy in? So, where are you going to live? And, it's interesting. I've had clients that have retired, that they sold that big house, and then they went to a retirement community. They sold the house for 900,000. The retirement community cost them 900,000, and they thought they were going to bank some money, and they didn't. But they got a lifestyle that they were more accustomed to, or that they wanted, which is they had community there, they had people there, they had clubs and activities. So as it relates to your home, all of this comes into play as to where do you want to live. And it's all about the lifestyle. Do you want to golf? Do you want to travel? All of that's relevant, and the more that you have going on, the happier and the more fulfilling retirement you're going to enjoy. Because again, at the end of the day, every day is Saturday. So sometimes on a Saturday it's nice to relax. But if you don't have interests and you don't have relationships, it can get a little bored after a while if you're not doing things. So I just tell you, keep that in mind. And then the last thing I always point out is health matters. I think it was George Burns years ago. He used to be a comedian. He lived till ripe old age. He used to always come out smoking a cigar. And what he said, I remember one time was, he's like, if I knew I was going to live this long, I'd have taken better care of my body. And so, you only get one shot at this. If you want to have a happy retirement, have a healthy retirement. So, health matters. You keep moving, you keep doing, you keep feeling better. So these are just a few of the things. And, I always say is you get to write your script. It starts with, how do you plan it? Working with, I call it, a coach advisor, CNA Financial Group. My cheap plugs for our advisors and our team here is we'll help you to work through all of this. We'll help you with the financial side. We'll help you with, the planning side, and really hearing what's important to you. What do you want your retirement to look like? So having said that, I'm going to wrap up at this point. I thank you for the time that we get to spend together each month. Again, it's our Wisdom Wednesday. Get out and vote. Um, have a great week, and we'll catch up to you next month. Thank you, and have a great evening.